Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. Here we are getting to the end of Pesach, and during the last days of Pesach, and finding yourselves weekly in this rhythm of Shabbat. And on this Shabbat, I note that there are two places of motion in Jewish life. One of them is crossing thresholds, and there are countless thresholds in Jewish life. We cross from 6 days of work into the seventh day of Shalom. We go from outside to inside. We cross the threshold into our homes. We cross thresholds all over the place. And in Passover, you cross them as well. The people of Israel cross a threshold, al Sfat Hayam, as they go out of Egypt. We also here are in the midst, we heard it earlier in our service, as we went from Mashiv Ruach and Morid HaGashem to Morid HaTal. We went from the rainy season in the land of Israel into this time of dew, this time of Tal, where there will be very little, if any, even not just no rain, but not even clouds in the sky in Jerusalem for months on end. And so that is a significant threshold to cross. There's also another that we celebrate in that same time with Morid HaTal. If you remember in the biblical story of the people of Israel in the wilderness, that Tal, the dew, was the source of manna, that the dew would collect and turn into manna each day. And here in Pesach, we note that moment of transition, but not from the wilderness, from Egypt into the wilderness, but now from the wilderness into the land of Israel, because we actually, when we do the Birkat HaTal, the blessing of Tal, and we read a Haftarah, we note when Moses passes the leadership to Joshua, and Joshua says, look, we've just crossed a threshold. We have now gone from the wilderness where God was feeding us with manna to the dew becomes dew again. It doesn't turn into manna. Now the Tal, the dew, is just dew, and we have to use it to be partners with God in taking care of the land, to produce our crops, because it's from our own crops and the own labor of our hands that we will eat. It's a huge threshold of responsibility, and here we are on the cusp of one of our young people, Aaliyah Hilliard, next week will be becoming bat mitzvah. That is that kind of threshold of responsibility. We've also had these interesting thresholds because we've gone from chametz to matzah, and now we are getting to the end of matzah and back to chametz. We go from that time where we eat all kinds of bread, leavened and unleavened bread, and for 7 days, these 8 days of Passover, depending on who you ask, we take the leavening, we take the chametz, the yeasts out of our lives, whether they are the physical yeasts, the leftover crackers and bread and pastas that build up in our cupboards and build up in our toasters and build up in our refrigerators, and clean that stuff out. Or if it's the spiritual chametz, as the rabbis point out, that chametz, that bubbly stuff, is kind of like Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. When we get a puffed up ego or attitude, when we get puffed up by our own anger or jealousy, when we bring those energies of the dark side into our world and into our lives, this is a chance to identify it and clean it out so we can start fresh and new. It's a powerful threshold because as you lead up to Passover, you're cleaning your kitchen, you're cleaning all of your spaces, you're taking out all of those crumbs, all of that detritus, giving away what you can, destroying, throwing away the rest. And then here we find ourselves in this time of matzah, of strictly unleavened bread. And here we're coming to the end of Passover. And it's another threshold. It's very much a threshold for me and for those of us who make sourdough bread, because chametz, yeast, is one of those things that we use all the time. It's in our sourdough starter. Chametz is sourdough starter. Davka, precisely, that is the chametz. I mean, that's the stuff, this bubbling collection. I wish I had my sample here, my culture, to show you. It's the bubbling stuff. If you take sourdough starter, if you take that culture of yeast and lactobacillus and the good stuff that eats the sugars and the flours and produces all of those acids and nutrients and all kinds of stuff that makes the bread rise and gives it all of this nutritional, incredible quality to it, if you take that stuff and you mix your bread and you take your dough and run out into the sun and it bakes, it never has a chance to rise, and all of those things die and disappear and are of no use. That's part of what our ancestors experienced when they went forth out of Egypt. They didn't have time for that bread to rise. They just had to run. They were refugees. They took their bread with them. It didn't have a chance to rise, and they eat what they had. That's been part of our experience of Passover. But now we're getting to the end of Passover. We're getting to the end. Last year's harvest is over. We're actually in the land of Israel. They're starting their new barley harvest and getting ready for the wheat harvest. That's what we acknowledge with the counting of the Omer. And it is time to start brewing our sourdough starter once again. Start getting our yeasts bubbling and ready for this new season with this new wheat. And so here's this threshold, because we get rid of the chametz, we get rid of that stuff, that puffiness, those things that are both leaven, both the food and those attitudes. And yet here we are at the end of Passover, passing back into this time beyond this holiday of absence. And how do we fill that space once again? And so as we pass through to a different threshold, I share something interesting with you, because it changed my thinking about this holiday in a very powerful and subtle way. His name is Seamus Blakely, and I share his name with you because he's also the inventor of the Xbox, which is a gaming console. Now you're saying, Rabbi, what does the inventor of the Xbox have to do with sourdough starter? And the answer is this. Seamus Blakely, in addition to being a technocrat or techno guy who makes things like gaming consoles, is also a microbiologist, is also a scientist. He's also apparently an agent in Hollywood, and has done all of these rather incredible things. Obviously a very intelligent guy. And somehow in the course of his curiosity as a nerd, as a geek, in college, he started making sourdough bread, and that became one of his life's passions. One of his ways of getting out of his head and his regular routines was to stop and make sourdough bread on a regular basis. And over time, as he's been interested in bread and its brother beer, they're, by the way, the same kind of process, just subtly different. He became interested in working with where were the origins of bread, because he knew that like the Romans copied the Greeks and the Greeks copied the Egyptians, where were the origins of sourdough starter of bread making? What was it like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago? And they discovered something very interesting about yeast. Yeast, apparently, is almost indestructible. The only way you can really stop it is with high amounts of heat, like the people of Israel experienced when their bread baked on their way out of the land of Egypt. But you can send yeast into space. You can bury yeast for thousands of years. You can have it in the ice of Antarctica. You can have yeast in all kinds of places. And all it does, it goes dormant. That's right, it hibernates. In Hebrew, or in the Jewish sense of Jewish value, it is a remnant. And what did Seamus Blakely get involved with? He got involved with an experiment through Harvard and through museums in Boston that had junk pottery from Egypt. These were discards, like they have so many daily cooking vessels that just got thrown into waste piles. And they started looking into the microscopic pores on this pottery. And what did they find? Yeast. The little tiny micromolecules of yeast from ancient Egypt. And what did they do? They breathed life back into it. They gave it some water, they gave it to food, and that yeast, and I use this word in a powerful way, was redeemed. Think about it, like the people of Israel in Egypt, crushed by hundreds of years of oppression and slavery, where they couldn't feed themselves or choose for themselves, they didn't live freely. They were under constant psychological and physical threat. What does God do? Breathes new life into them, helps them, lead them to freedom. They pass through the waters, and there they fully come to a place of redemption, full of life, dancing and singing. That is what Seamus Blakely and his colleagues did for these yeasts of ancient Egypt, but instead of a few hundred years, it was a few thousand years. But they took those yeasts and brought them back to life. They redeemed them. They were always, I say that incorrectly, they were always alive. They were dormant. They were just waiting for a partner to give them attention and love and care. And now, Seamus Blakely and his friends, and all kinds, some of them in lab conditions, some in their own kitchens, are taking these yeasts from 4,000 years ago and using them to make bread. Now, the chutzpah, the weird craziness of them, he says instead of our modern wheat, they like the ancient Pharaoh and Emmer wheat that he can still find. They like that much better for making bread. Go figure. But regardless, they've taken this remnant, something left over from the time when our ancestors were in Egypt. And just like our ancestors in the stuck and narrow place, they have been brought forth and given life. And so I have to wonder if it's a threshold, if it's a going back and forth from space into space, or if there's something different in matzah and chametz, that it's not a threshold, but a paradox. Because sometimes that chametz is what sours us, what brings us down, which when we get too puffed up, sours the world around us, pollutes the world around us. And yet there are other times when it's that chametz, that it's a reminder with just the right ruach and koach, with just the right spirit and care, with just the right kinds of love, we can bring life. We can create sustenance. We can take something, and it's not bring life, speaking correctly. What it is making life expand. That just the right energy in partnership with those around us creates something incredible and takes with something that's tiny and small and gets it to expand and expand and to expand. And so here, as Passover comes to an end, as we get ready to change our diets back from this bread of affliction and eating our bread and our pasta and crackers and all the other chametz that we can find, as some of us go back to breaking our breads and our cookies and our cakes, as we shift back and go from matzah to chametz, I want you to be thinking, I want you to be wrestling, I want you to be looking with your eyes, looking in those tiny places and for those tiny moments, when instead of taking that stuff that clogs us and pulls us down and weighs us down out of our life, that's what we've been doing for these days of Pesach, down. Excuse me. In this season, in this time, it's our chance to look for those moments, to offer some water, to offer some food, to offer some light and love, to look for those tiny little pieces of creation that just need a little bit of energy and partnership for us so that we can expand not just ourselves, not just our families, but expand our sense of community. Take the little bit of shalom that we find, a little bit of what sustains us so that we have energy for our day, and take that and spread that throughout our world. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.